Okay, great. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to the Flyte Contributors meetup. Glad to see you all here. I'm David Espejo. I'm an open source developer advocate at Union AI, and I'll be your host today. Couple of reminders. First, this session is being recorded and we will be posted to Flyte's YouTube channel. There's a new playlist for the contributors meetup. And second thing is that Flyte is an AI and data foundation project. So this meeting falls into their code of conduct, which basically boils down to be nice to each other. Cool. Right. So again, probably for the third time, let me add the link for the agenda notes here. And let's quickly welcome new members. So I see some new faces. Tim, would like to briefly introduce yourself here?
Sure. I'm Tim Shiner. I just joined Union as the head of product design. I'm not sure I'm actually going to be much of a contributor to Flyte, but David invited me to come to this meeting, so I thought I would come and see.
Absolutely. There are many ways to contribute. Thank you for joining. All right. I don't know, Greg, is this your first time in this meeting?
Yeah, first timer for me. So thanks for inviting me to this, and have been a long time user of Flyte and trying to ramp up some of my contributions. So yeah, excited to be part of this meeting and the team.
Awesome. Great to have you here. Okay, seems like no other new faces here. Awesome. So next thing in the agenda will be to review outstanding RFCs. Let me quickly share my screen here. And there's a new GitHub project. Thank you, Niels, for your help building this. The idea is to basically have a central place so you can not only see the RFCs, but the status or the stage they're in. There's a couple of new ones. I know that Keaton has to leave early, so I'll go first with Keaton. Keaton, I don't know if you want to briefly introduce this proposal.
David, we are joining, like Keaton including, is joining this meeting from the other room. So give it, a minute.
Okay,
We'll
cool.
be right back.
No problem. Cool. So in the meantime, I see Byron here, and I see that you just in the config override RFC. There's already a really interesting discussion in the issue and the PR itself. But for the benefit of the audience, would you like to briefly introduce this proposal?
Yeah, sure. Would you mind I sharing my screen?
Yep. Need the link to it, or?
Yeah, I think I have. Okay. So yeah, I think there are some ongoing discussion for this, and okay, I'll briefly go through it.
Okay.
So this issue has been discussing for a pretty long time, and basically the issue is that for the test config, the config that is inside the test decorator. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So for the test config, and what is test config? It's the one inside the test annotation. They cannot be modified after they got registered. We cannot modify them at execution time. And for us, it's because we heavily rely on reference workflow. So we want to change some test config of the reference workflow during execution time. So we are figuring out the best way to reach the consensus from the open source side and linking side. And basically, after a long discussion, we think that this might be a possible solution. So basically, we'll create a Flyte IDO, and it looks similar to this. So it has workflow override, and under workflow override, it can has test override or workflow override, so that it can be nested to many layers. Yeah, and the API will basically look like this. So fly remote.execute or fly CTO, and you can also include this in your execution file. But I think so I think the other one bring up another discussion is here. So the other way of doing this is that, okay, we still path with override, but we can target for some task with something like filter. For example, we target for task A, and input is like this. And then if the task match the pattern, we'll execute the override. I think the idea makes sense, but I'm not sure how to implement this idea on UI to have a better experience. Yeah, I think that the difficult part of the whole thing is the UI part. I'm wondering if you guys has any suggestion on this. Yeah.
I had a question on that. Do you mean by UI the front end UI Flyte console, or do you mean UX?
Front end UI. I think for fly remote and fly CTO is fine, but I just can't figure out a way to better do this on the front end.
Got it. Fabio, please.
Yeah, the main concern that I had when I read this is what you, sorry, I forgot your name. I need to look up your name.
Byron.
No, not yours. Bernard.
No.
Sorry, your name, Bernard. What you raised, that when we have like map tasks in there or dynamics, then the name of the node will be very complicated and nested, right? Like this can be like, I can't even say it now, but it will be a very complicated string, right? And when I read that, I had the idea that maybe when registering the task, we can mark the task for overridable and give it a name there. And then in the UI, when you launch the workflow, we would just have a list of the tasks that are marked as overridable. Okay. So not every task by default is overridable.
That's a pretty good idea. But what if the task reside in a very deep layer, like in your workflow of a workflow or something?
I mean, in principle, I haven't like fully thought through how it will be implemented, but even if it happens very deep inside and it's registered in a dynamic sub workflow, at one point the dynamic sub workflow will realize, I'm registering a task now that is marked as override with the name foo. Actually, from the console when we started this, I was told that whatever is called foo should run with 2 GPUs. I hit that case now. This needs 2 GPUs. Then we would have avoided basically all the nesting.
That's a pretty good idea. So you mean on Flyte console, so on each task, we can specify whether this is overridable, and this is on test level, not workflow level.
You give it a name also.
Yeah, also give it a name, and on Flyte UI, we'll show it up. Oh, that's nice. So
basically to avoid the nesting problem.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And I think for that case, we'll need to, so for the Flyte remote, we also just specify the name, the override test name, and then pass it. So it won't be nested anymore. Okay, yeah, I want to hear others. So yeah, okay, Keaton, right. Oh, great.
Please.
Yeah, it was actually Eduardo.
Yeah,
I just raised for him.
Okay.
Yeah. So
right.
how? Sorry, I have a question about this suggestion that Fabio gave. Like how does this work with dynamic? Like this idea of naming the overrides?
So let's say we have a workflow that has a dynamic sub-workflow that registers some tasks in the dynamic sub-workflow. At that point, when I have my Python file, when I register it, I know that in the dynamic sub-workflow, I know that I'm executing a task or running a task at that point that at a later point I want to be able to override. So in the dynamic sub-workflow where I call a task, I don't know the syntax. Instead, it could be .task with runtime overrides and then give it a name. And then in the UI, basically when this is registered, we would have to show in the list all the runtime overrides with the name that at one point might be used, and then I can specify them there. And then whenever we register something dynamically, we realize, oh, okay, the user, when starting the execution, they specified that the runtime override foo, I'm registering a task now with runtime override foo. I need to use the GPUs that the whatever user specified. Basically, I mean, it's not fully thought through, but that would allow us to avoid like this very complicated nesting problem that we might not know beforehand.
Yeah. So essentially you name the overrides, right? And you pass that when you kick off the execution, and you use that in your like anywhere, like in your workflow, sub-workflows, dynamics.
We could even we could even reuse them, like.
Yeah, even reuse them, exactly.
So is that like a separate stored entity in the system? Sorry, I don't get that part. How do you name, like when do you name the overrides?
At registration.
And when do you use them?
When you kick
I would
off the
say
execution.
I mean, that was an idea like 20 minutes ago. I did not think through how it would be implemented. It's basically right now how I would want it to be in Python and in console. But basically, you would assign the name of the overrides at registration time. And then in the console, or when you create the execution spec YAML file, would basically get the list of existing runtime overrides, and then you can choose to fill them or not fill them.
So if I had to paraphrase this, are you saying that basically create override hooks? So when you define the task or a workflow itself, you kind of say, I am overridable. You can override me by X, right? Yes. And I actually think that is the cleanest interface, but what about like, should everything automatically have names then by default? But if that is the case, then it kind of defeats the purpose.
I think you should maintain the with overrides, the nameless with overrides that we have today.
But the with override only happens within the declaration time, right? No, so one of the reasons why we haven't implemented Byron, I told you this, right? This is just the hardest problem in UX. It's like, it is just no consistently good way of doing it. Especially for large workflows, it becomes like almost unmanageable. But I think we probably should just constrain it to a smaller workflow. I like the idea of naming. It's cleaner.
Like of all these suggestions, like this idea of relying on node IDs was always the thing that like really it didn't seem clean, you know?
But I think that should be the default that's available. I'm just saying that it should be a combination. So if you name hooks, if you have named hooks in your workflow, just override those hooks. If there are no hooks, then then you have to know the names of the nodes and so on, and probably nobody will use them, which is okay, right?
I mean,
but it's like
in that.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, for a simple workflow, like the node names are fine, right? But when it comes to dynamic, it's probably impossible to know these things beforehand, or like very unnice to use that.
Yeah, it's like it's impossible to use dynamic. Yeah, and especially now, I don't know if you guys have seen what Niels has been working on, async tasks. It's just fully dynamic. There is no override. There are overrides at runtime only, really, right? That's what's happening over there. So
I really like these names.
So
and this is solved.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Byron.
Yeah. So I think not all the tasks need to be override. Just some tasks, for example, TF job using a lot of resource, and we want to tune the resource, we can add an overwritable tag on this. If we have all the node defaultly can be overwritten, we'll come back to the same problem. It will become the UI will become very complicated. It will be nested.
Yeah, and I'm sure Tim is listening to all of this, and it'll be interesting. But hey, Greg, do you want to contribute to here, or you have another separate question?
Yeah.
I think you should just step in.
Yeah, separate question, like relating to this comment. It's more about like the UX when it comes to like actually handling the workflow definition and handling the overrides. So if you like click on that link or just like scroll down or like scroll to the comments on this thread. So I put a link in chat, if you can see chat.
Right.
Like the Zoom chat. Yeah, nice. So like this, it shows like the workflow definition, and like those parameters to the workflow are actually like promises. So like one thing I really would love is to be able to like pass those promises to that like override config, exactly what's shown here. So pretty much just like ensuring that that functionality works.
You mean this one?
Yeah, exactly. Like, do you see how you're like providing C1 and M1? Like those are promises right now. So
But-
like, I never really got it figured
Yeah.
out where I could like actually resolve those promises and handle overrides, if that makes sense. So I'm not sure what work it would take to get there, but like that is the UX that I want when developing a workflow.
Yeah, I agree.
I actually think here's my problem with it. They are not inputs. I don't think we should confuse them with input. I think that's one thing that we've kind of gotten pretty nice in Flyte, that inputs and outputs are clean and separate, and they are what business logic is. This is config, and let's call that config, right? Like, and with Fabio's idea of named overrides, basically it's like a hook in your config, and you can say like, oh, there is something that expects
The distinction is pretty clear.
yeah,
right?
config X, and then you just like pass that in, and how you make it work is like PyFlight run could take a YAML, Flyte CTL run could take a YAML, UI could take.
So you're imagining, sorry, like every workflow would then take a config as an optional parameter.
Execution.
Gotcha. Yeah,
I don't think
that works.
workflow should.
Yeah.
I don't think workflow should take a config.
But-
I don't like that idea. I think execution should. Like that's like.
Oh yeah, that's totally
workflows
fine.
have a
It's
config.
actually,
Okay.
yeah, that's how we do it. Like at Freenome, we actually have the workflows take an overrides parameter that defines the overrides. But yeah, doing it on the execution makes so much more sense.
Bernard.
But I do agree with Greg that this is a most intuitive way, so we can parameterize it and then passing to it. We don't need to, because if we want to do in execution time, we'll need to pass another thing with Flyte remote or pass another thing on UI.
Yeah, and
this is kind of dirty. I agree.
But with the async task stuff, you should be able to do this. Let's not invent a way within Flyte to do this through unraveling promises. And I don't think you guys have seen that probably, but like hopefully Niels will do a talk soon and like share it in the contributors guide. But I think you'll be able to do this completely as this is. I don't think users will really like it, because we've used users, they're like, suddenly you're saying C1. And they have to now understand C1 is used somewhere else as an input, and it's kind of confusing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, like you're thinking about like
Yes.
two. When you think about two, T1 and T2, it's easy. When you have T1, T2, T4, distributed Spark, XYZ, another Spark is because
The moment you make this a parameter,
now-
like imagine you have these deeply nested, sub workflows with dynamics, like it would be very polluted. Like
yeah.
Could we actually have that config too tracked in like IDL somewhere, like on the execution too, would be really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
And also caching pollution.
What?
Sorry, like what Dan said, caching pollution is true, right? It will cache.
Oh, yeah.
You're now passing random inputs, and then it will cache pollute, which is not a good reason. Probably you don't want that. So
Yeah, I agree. So Kaitan, what's the best way in your mind? Is it using the overwritable annotation, or just the way I suggest here?
I think what you suggested is the mechanics of how they will get applied. But instead of N0 and N1, I like the idea of Fabio to cut short using basically hooks. Bernard, you have a thing to say. So
Yeah.
Let Bernard go first.
I think technically we might have a problem. For example, that dynamic launch plans don't know what they launched beforehand, right? So the hooks might not show up, or in a nested workflow that has like a sub. I think there's like some technicalities where they're not sure of, by like specifying those hooks. And the second thing is for like if you have the same task twice, you couldn't run it with different resources in case that's a requirement that needs to be fulfilled. So right, if you have, for example, you map over a thing and then based on the inputs you want to have different.
But you could have hooks at the workflow declaration, so node level, right? You can, and that's what Fabio is saying probably.
And I didn't say to do it in a task decorator. I meant to do it like with overrides when you do it in the workflow. So when you call the task there twice, you can have two hooks.
Okay.
But you'd still have it in the task decorator where it would specify whether it's overrideable, right? That would be like a Boolean.
No, I actually wouldn't do that in a task decorator. I would say, as we currently have like node.with override, I would say like node.with override hook or with named override, and do it at that level, because then you can call a task n times in the workflow and have n different hooks for it. And with the dynamic,
Okay.
that is
I got your point.
That is valid.
Would that work in dynamic task? Are dynamic tasks passed at registration time so that they would then show up in?
You could still already, maybe we couldn't pre-fill the name in the UI in the console or the execution spec file. But if you know, just like from looking at the code, that there will be a task called in a dynamic sub workflow with the named hook foo, then you can put that in the UI because you know that it will come. And then when it's being registered in the dynamic sub workflow, then then it should be detected. Oh, the user specified a hook with the name foo. Now we encountered this. Now it's time to use this. Like it would be nice if there was a way to make it already like shown in the UI that this will come up. But at least for me, if for dynamic sub workflows, and we can't right now make it show up beforehand, but we can still like add it. And then once it's discovered, it will be used. I think that's also like fine.
I think I have a suggestion over here. In the workflow, when you do with override, we could call it something like with dynamic config or something, right? And call the config as C. In the dynamic case, it's impossible, right? We don't parse the dynamic workflow, and that's by design. We don't want to parse. We don't have the inputs materialized, so we can't parse it. But I think what we could ask is the users have to take the internal overrides and specify it, and we can ensure that they are available when a dynamic task is run. So that, because actually if you realize what happens in dynamic is when you run the dynamic workflow, it gets compiled after that point. So the task definitions themselves change. The entire tasks, even though they look the same, you can override the config, do whatever you want with the config and push that out. So there is no runtime override in the traditional sense in dynamic. This doesn't exist because you can modify anything. Like what Byron showed as an example can be done today with dynamic, like C1, C2. And I know people do it. So, but then the user should be able to say, here are 4 dynamic configurations that I need for this task. And that could be the dynamic task declaration point, probably. It's like a workflow. That's the only way them in dynamics, right? I don't know other ways. Like a list in your config that you say like XYZ you need. It's terrible. But what else can I do? It could be when you call the dynamic in the workflow, right? With config override XYZ.
All right, Dan, please.
Yes.
Yeah, my only comment on this was like, as this scales, if this is the solution, I mean, I don't think there's any good way to determine like what a unique idea of what this override is going to be. But like Byron says, they massively use reference workflows and things like that. Like telling I think that if we just use like a unique ID that a user defines on a task, sub workflows, nested all kinds of stuff, reference workflows, we are going to run into tons of situations where a config override gets applied somewhere where the user did not want it to be overridden, right? Like there's going to be specified as foo in 2 different places, and all of a sudden they're going to say, why is my task being done with this? Especially if they don't have like access to the task definition using like a reference workflow. And then you're going to have like re-registering workflows so that they change the task, override here that you're using for the unique ID. Does anybody else foresee that being a problem? I guess just want to bring up this conversation. If this is a thing we're going to go with, I think it's an issue that could happen.
I mean, it should definitely be a project domain and also workflow, right?
You're saying make them specific by project domain and workflow?
Yes.
Which it could default to current running project or something.
Yes.
Otherwise, make them overrideable too.
Yeah, if you have two workflows that both have foo defined, and then somebody has a workflow that they call both of those workflows as sub workflows or reference workflows, then foo is going to be overridden in both of them and not a single one, right?
Yeah, but wouldn't defaulting to project domain of current execution be fine and just allow that to be overridden and maybe even like check for conflicts at runtime? If that, I don't know. Check for naming conflicts, if that makes sense.
Checking for, this is what I'm saying, like checking for naming conflicts and then like warning the user that they're being applied incorrectly or something like that. It becomes very complicated very quick.
Basically what you're referring to then is when I'm importing another workflow in my workflow where I'm not exactly sure how it looks like and what it does exactly and just consuming its outputs, then I might be overriding something in that workflow that I'm not aware of. That's what you're saying, right?
Potentially.
So are you saying that, for example, I register hook and then in foo, but maybe in other sub workflow, there's also another foo I didn't know. So, okay, that makes sense.
Great. All right, I'm sure you all have more comments and ideas about this proposal, and happy to see this. I encourage everyone to keep the conversation async also in the PR itself, especially, I think.
Can I suggest, David, can I suggest one thing? I think there is no right way. I feel that we should launch this as an experimental feature. I don't know if it's really doable in a way. We have to, as a community, allow these kind of crazy ideas to be possible, right? A lot of people have asked for this. Nobody's ever come up with a good solution. It's just that I would love to say that, move ahead. As long as you don't destabilize the system, please do not destabilize the system. People won't like it. So if we can somehow avoid that.
Could use this opportunity to tag this feature as experimental somehow,
Yeah.
Literally use it. Like the modules that we import in FlyteKit to use this.
I think the hooking method is the best one I've ever seen so far. I think it's the cleanest way to do it.
Okay. Fabio says wild idea.
Okay.
Yeah, like I can't press Shift Enter and type more text, so the rest is coming in a few minutes.
Okay. Should we move on to a much less contentious one?
This is great. Yeah, probably the next one in the agenda was your proposal, Keaton, around this is system tags and metadata. Let me share my screen real quick. Or do you want to share a screen?
Yeah, sharing my screen. Yeah. So just to quickly go over, this is another thing that we have heard from some users, including MethaneSat. I think LinkedIn also commented on it. People from Roboception, Stripe, a few other people have commented on this idea. And so the reason why this exists is I tried to write a few reasons like what people think. One of them is today, if you go to the Flyte UI, you see a bunch of executions. You can't group them. You can't. And most people are running experiments, and they sometimes want to group those experiments. There's no easy way. Let's say you have a system that is built on top of Flyte, which some other people are building like Latch, etc. And even you may want to add your own flag and group things. So that's one of the reasons. Second is this is something that actually people have asked in the past is like releases in GitHub. That means you create you mark a specific Git SHA as a release, right? And so it's nothing but a tag on the release. And when you add that, it actually, you can now depend on it existing, and you can query for it, you can do things with it. So that's interesting with models, right? If your pipeline generates a model, you may mark this model as production ready or deployable or whatever, right? Or release 1.0 and 1.1, and you can do some work, and you can probably scan through the list. Another one is, one problem today is like, if you take a workflow and it launches a bunch of launch plans, and people who are doing this at scale will know, like for example, Black Shark and Insight specifically, they launch about 20,000 or 50,000 workflows from a single workflow, or more, 100,000 workflows, I think. It's impossible to track at some level which workflow launched which other workflows. Even though there is like a chaining and dependency, it's not easy. So with tags, you could actually group all of these executions together. And as I said, external systems could group, and then users could name their executions without having to worry about the naming limits. This is like Theorem and a few other people asked for. It's like, hey, I want to call my experiment Bernard's favorite experiment 1, right? And I don't have to think about that it is URL safe, etc., etc. You just want to give a name. And then finally, make it easy to simplify, filtering. So that was the idea. That's how I thought about it. And the interesting thing that I found is that most of our protobufs today already support labels and annotations. And labels are essentially this. So I was like, what if we could just make them key value pairs and use labels to store the value? The CLI interface in that case would look something like this. When you do Flyte run, you would pass the labels at launch time. If you use flightctl, you do the same. You could also get the execution and filter it by labels. So you can retrieve. And the UI interface is even more interesting. You could actually put something like label. Again, I'm not a UX designer. This is just a proposal, an idea. And I think Tim or somebody else could do a better job than me. The idea would be that you would have labels, and you would have a free-form search field instead of the current multiple filters. And you should be able to write the key value, maybe the execution ID, the workflow name, and it just starts filtering them, grouping them like that. While I was doing this, I realized this is another thing some people have asked for us, is that every execution that I create, I want to add a label. I want to add some description to it. Like this is like, think about this as model card or things like that I may want to add. Just the description part of it, because Flyte has the remaining part. So this is where this idea came in, where we should be allowed to add description. And so same thing, you could be allowed to do Flyte run remote XIZ, and you can optionally add a description to it. You could also pass in a readme.md, and boom, that gets uploaded to that execution. And so now your UI shows that it's here. You can read the description, you can edit the description, you can see it, and it gets preserved with your history. So now that we are with the Doc Hub stuff, which is coming soon, which already exists right in the code, but Kevin's working on adding it to the UI, you get a GitHub link. With that, now we actually get descriptions. So it becomes like your one place where you go to unravel what's happening, right, with your model. So that was the idea. Drawbacks, there are actually two big drawbacks. One is this is an overhead. Like this is extra storage, but when I did some basic math, if we limit the total number of labels, we can limit it to like a couple gigabytes in database, so it's not a big deal. The real big problem is, Byron, good that you're here. I think I would have loved Ankit to be here too. MySQL doesn't support an easy way of doing key value pairs. Well, Postgres supports it, right? You can use HStore, or I forget the extension name. So we will have to model this as a separate table. And if you look at it, what we have done specifically in Flyte executions table is have avoided doing any kind of joins. This has been done like, purposely. And the reason why we did it is because even though we use a RDBMS table, we didn't want to use it like an RDBMS table. No queries, no joins. so that the writes are fast and the reads are fast, index builds are fast, etc. This might impact that a little bit, even though it's only at the top level execution, which doesn't get that many writes on an already created execution. But this is just a problem. We could do it differently. For MySQL, use two tables. For Postgres, use the same table. I don't know what the right way to do is. I'm not an expert. GORM, especially GORM expert. But that's one of the reasons why we haven't already implemented it, because the entire code already exists. We store the labels as well, but inside the closure, we have to export them out into the key value pairs and just add a simple PyFlyte run, and boom, it should be there, and then UI work. So that's the RFC in short. Any votes? Anything people don't like?
Awesome. Any comment, observation about this proposal? I hope you were paying attention to Keaton instead of watching Fabio implement an RFC in the chat. I really hope so.
Fabio, you stole the show.
I was listening though.
No problem.
Oh wow, this is an entire RFC here.
Right.
I have a couple of questions.
I wonder. Oh, sorry. You first.
Oh, okay. So take this with a grain of salt, because I'm pretty ignorant still about how this whole thing works. But I think one thing I'm wondering, I mean, to me, that seems like a good idea. I'm wondering about kind of like default tags, or like one thing I noticed already in the UI is that it doesn't automatically group things by workflow or task name. And unless maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I'm just wondering about like those things being sort of default tags.
It does group things by workflow name automatically, right? And for every single task execution, it groups. That's the automatic default grouping. It doesn't group by version automatically, and version should be the default tags. You're right. A version is like a default tag. The launch plan name could be the default tag. Even though we have a separate page for launch plans itself that groups by launch plan already.
Okay, well, maybe it's an implementation in the UI, but like when you go to the UI right now, it's not very prominent at all. Like you have to look pretty hard to see which execution was which workflow. Like, so maybe I'm just misunderstanding the UI.
I think it's not hard to see which execution was which workflow. If you go to the project page, yes. But if you go to the workflow page, then it's grouped. But you're right. At the project page, it's not like clearly obvious that, and that's a great feedback. And I think we could add all of these as default tags, but that limits the total number of tags and adds extra craft. We don't need to add these as tags because that data already exists in the system. So, but you're right. Like that's the idea of thinking about tags.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but like I guess what I would say is make sure that this proposal isn't like redundant to the fact that I already named my workflow and named my tasks. That's all. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I wouldn't want to have to like tag something that I already gave a name to.
But yeah, you wouldn't have to. That would exist. Sorry, go ahead.
And the other thing I was thinking about with the description part is, to me, it's kind of like, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems like when I, I guess, register, run, like it's a little bit like making a commit in a way. And so, standard with a commit, right? You have to have a message. And I wonder if instead of treating this proposal as like tags and descriptions is the thing, it's like separate that out. And instead there is a separate proposal, like there should just be a required message every time you do this thing, you do a run, like, so then it's more like, you get the description is that.
That's a great point. It's just that we can't make it required because there are many systems automatically launching things, and I don't want to force them to add a description. This is like in the case where people are actually using ad hoc behavior of executing. But Fabio?
I think this is not only supposed to be happening at registration time, right? The use case that I mostly see is when people are running a bunch of experiments and they realize, hey, that's a good one here. Let's mark that one so that we find it again. Let's write what we did here so that we can remember what it was, because we're running so much things in parallel. And that's what our ML engineers, they do currently in OneDB. So I wrote that also in the RC. On every Flyte run, we use the DAG to just put the link to OneDB, and then we do all the grouping and tagging and describing there post execution, not at registration time, to just summarize basically whether this run was good or not. And I think that would be great to do that in Flyte and not in OneDB. But I wanted to say that in response to you, Tim, because what you mentioned is all at registration time, right? But I think the labels are, like, of course, the workflow name is known at registration time, and some labels maybe you can give at registration time, but I think the compelling feature is being able to do it after execution to find stuff again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like there are people who are actually maintaining, I met some people who are maintaining logbooks of execution IDs to like, to whatever their internal idea was. And I'm like, oh, this is like completely inverted. It's not what we want to achieve. And that's what motivated this feature, I think.
Got it.
Wait, can you say that one more time? What did you not want to achieve?
So there were people I met some, there was one biotech company. I can't name the company at the moment. I was talking to them and they're like, oh, we have this, this piece of software that maintains a link to a launch with a human readable name for that launch. And that was, they maintain it through in some UI of some sort. Another team that I met, they were actually using spreadsheets, like literally like Google Sheets. So every time they launch something, they would take a link, put it in the spreadsheet, and write next to it some description and some tag. And I'm like, this is like just bookkeeping metadata that you're doing. And that's what we want to stop. And Greg, what do you think? I don't know, do you guys, have you seen this?
Yeah, well, like we're very like notebook driven in that like important readouts often like call Flyte workflows in a notebook, and then that notebook is saved somewhere in version tracking, and that's like used for a report. There's also tools that like wrap the notebooks. Like, I don't know if you've seen Quarto or like Jupyter Book, but there's ways to make like formal reports with a Jupyter notebook. And I'm like trying to think of like how that could be relevant for like the execution tagging. Like you showed that it would like support Markdown. So like, would those reports almost make sense, almost like tied to the execution, or am I trying to combine two things? Like, it's probably not. Like we always have like the execution details like in the notebook cell, if that makes sense. Which will often like refer to that as our like source of truth.
But again, you've built things out of it, right? Just to support like one simple use case of discovery and descriptions and tags. The notebooks are description, but the tag would be when you launch something from your notebook, you might want to give your experiment that you were running at that point a name, right?
Yep, we do like model grouping. We like typically use like weights and biases for that to like group a bunch of models and do comparisons on them. But the tags would be like perfect for that use case of like establishing hierarchy of models. And
another tag could be an external system ID, right? Like it could be another tag. So, but anything else? Byron, you were trying to say something, I think. Byron? Oh, we lost it. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I have a second question as Fabio. Are users allowed to modify the label after the execution is executed?
No, labels cannot be modified after execution, in my opinion. Or maybe you can. I think we should allow it probably for like adding new labels, like
just change
release. Because like I envision
more useful.
Yeah, like I envision doing things like in Flyte Remote, which yesterday I saw a great proposal from EE internal, like he was just talking to me yesterday, retrieve, right? And he was just showing me you can retrieve like, let's say a model or an artifact from a previous execution. If you could put just the label of a release version, like a semver, say 1.x.x, I don't care, match the most recent and pull that down. It would, like, you could start doing model deployments very, very easily, right? Like automating the full model deployment. So that's my, like, so maybe for that, we probably want to allow editing the labels after the fact. Could be a V2, like, doesn't need to be in the MVP, but probably.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Probably the last thing to cover here. We don't have much time right now. Unless there's anything you'd like to comment or about the array node proposal. If not, next thing was real quick, taking a look at the incubator. Probably we don't have time to introduce some of these ideas. Thank you, Fabio. Yeah, keep the conversation going in the PR itself. Yeah, the RFC incubator is probably you already saw the changes to the RFC process. This is kind of stage 0, where you can put here ideas way before writing an RFC, just to gauge interest from the community to see if that would be a good idea. And from here, you can convert this to issue and continue the process. So there are several ideas here. Yeah, most of them have been authored by Niels. I don't know if Niels is still here and you wanted to comment something about this.
Yeah, I made a bunch of half-baked proposals. I'll develop them as I go. Basically, the next one that I want to put in everyone's radar is eager mode. Yeah, I'll prepare that for the next time, and we can discuss.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I encourage everyone to take a look at this section of the discussions, add your comments. It's a good place also to catch ideas early on in the process. So that's great. One of the ideas, this one came from me, was establishing special interest groups. Probably it's something more in the housekeeping side of things, but kind of the idea and the inspiration to propose more kind of the community, inside the community, some more focused communities that will help us keep unlocking the innovation and leveraging the expertise from the community. Here's the idea. Take a look at your comments before this turns into our RFC. All right. I think we don't have much time to discuss this.
Hey,
yeah.
I have one question. So how can we add more to the RFC incubator? Just an issue, or is this in discussions?
Just a new discussion, right? Yeah, just a new discussion. There's no format designed for this. Just post here early ideas and start collecting interest from the community.
Yeah, I would love to add. I have 5 or 6 of them sitting somewhere, so I will add them. Some of them are tiny, easy, some of them are bigger, so would love to do it.
Awesome. All right. Okay, anything else that you would like to quickly discuss here?
I have one more thing. So Flyte Kit is going through a lot of changes all the time, right? I would love for so a couple things that I would love over there is help in reviewing PRs from the team, and second is helping contributing like some low level. These are not really features, but like enhancements within the system, and those could go through an RFC process or could just be working groups. I don't know. One of them is like asynchronous data, completely async IO support for all of the data portions, like type transformers and so on. Like, I don't know if you've seen, but recently I added support for streaming. I don't know if it's released, but streaming files and directories like dynamically. Also, he completely changed the base data layer to use FSPEC and Arrow in some cases. So, but I think that work is never going to be done, right? It's a lot of work. Like, so we would love help in like analyzing performance and improving those areas. One of the like Dan did a performance deep dive and he found that most of the propeller parts are pretty fast, but Flyte Kit itself is taking 8 seconds to print hello world from start to end. And we don't know why. And so we would love to help and analyze specifically people who are great at Python. And I know this community is much better than me at Python. So they can help improve many stupid things that we have done in Flyte Kit. Like one person today was asking about why is Flyte Kit have so many dependencies? I want to cut down those dependencies. Please help. So those are the I'm basically a plea for help is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, I forgot to mention that Greg has been nominated as contributor to Flyte Kit. Thank you, Greg, for stepping up to help. And yeah, we'll keep refining the contributor ladder. And yeah, feel free to step up and help building Flyte. Awesome. Yeah, we ran out of time. Thank you all for attending, for your contributions. This was a fantastic session. And yeah, hope to see you in the next one.
I really enjoyed that.
We're going to show everyone.
Yeah.
See you. Bye.
Thanks all.
Hey, I have a